It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, our second episode of our seventh season here in 2025. And today I have as my guest an author. His name is Ian Stockdale. He is the author of Shakespeare, the King James Version, which argues in favor of James VI of Scotland, also known as James I of England, as the possible solution to the Shakespeare authorship mystery. He's an independent researcher with a bachelor's degree in political science from Simon Fraser University, and he lives in Burnaby, British Columbia, another international guest. Ian, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's wonderful. I always enjoy having guests to talk about the different theories and the different candidates that have been proposed as solutions to this great mystery. And one of the things that I love about your research and your writings is you're really, more so than most of anything I've ever read about King James and the Stuarts in particular, you're really steeped in the history. And your book provides a lot of in-depth detail about the history, things that I hadn't found in other things that I've read about this king who somehow, though he is so well known thanks to the King James Bible, of course, actually sort of, I feel like has lived sort of in obscurity, sort of in the shadow of his cousin Elizabeth and his mother Mary, who obviously so famously lost her head. And so it's great to bring him to the surface in every level, especially in this level now in connection to the works of Shakespeare.
Yeah, well, thanks, Stephen. That's where I kind of come from as like a history buff. I never was a huge Shakespeare fan, I have to say, or anything like that. I mean, I did the odd thing in high school and college and whatnot, but that's kind of my focus. And for me, it's been all the huge learning. I mean, it's been a learning process, learning about James, but certainly the biggest learning curve for me is learning about Shakespeare as his whole oeuvre, as you might say, and how that relates. I was going to say that with James, often he's either Mary's son when we're talking about things happening with Mary when he's a newborn baby, or where he comes in after Elizabeth, which was completely tied in our culture for whatever reason to Elizabeth, and Shakespeare and Elizabeth are tied together. He never seems to be the one doing the acting, right? Even kind of when it comes to the King James Bible, and he's kind of the victim of the gunpowder plot. He's always kind of not really in the center whenever kind of anything is being discussed, except for our conversation now. But
oddly, he's sort of like a shadow king in a lot of ways, which is really incredible to me when you look at some of the details of his life, which you include. Like the first 100 pages or so of your book are really about his life, his history. And so we kind of get to know the man before you then dive into your theories about how he is connected to the Shakespeare canon. And when you realize some of the details about him, king at, I think, the age of 13 months. So then there are 4 different regents who sort of keep him alive because he's their like goose with the golden egg, isn't he? He's kind of like their claim to power. It's almost incredible that he even survives, except that they need this little baby boy in order for them to maintain their power until he sort of comes into his own and is given the full crown. And then he sort of takes off like this, phenom of sorts. He's super intelligent and highly educated, isn't he?
Absolutely. Yeah. and I think intentionally mysterious and in the shadows. He's the Duke of Dark Corners, right? And I think he in order to survive in that crazy, chaotic, brutal Scotland of the 16th century, he had to be wily and manipulative. But he was not. I mean, he was disabled. He didn't use his. He wasn't this man on a horse kind of king. His skill was his intelligence, his learning, and his literary ability, and he used that as well as his manipulative powers and his spying and all that to succeed.
Well, you mentioned his disability, and I don't think a lot of people, though we have multiple historical references to attribute that to, I don't think that a lot of us are aware that he had this sort of physical deformity of sorts with his lower limbs. And there are multiple references, including physician references, that talk about his legs being underdeveloped, not having been fully formed, that he didn't walk until he was a fairly old child, like 5 years old, before he was actually walking on his own. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that detail about his life. But I feel like, as is true with a lot of people who have a disability of some form or another, they sort of, their bodies, their minds compensate in a different way, and they become exceptional in something else. And for him, I think it was his studies. He just seemed to be a highly intelligent and fast learner.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You bring a lot of attention in the early pages of the book. And again, just for the listeners, I'll remind them, the book is called Shakespeare, the King James Version, and it is Ian Stockdale. That's spelled Stockdale. You can find it anywhere books are sold. Shakespeare, the King James Version. You bring out some other details I wasn't aware of with regards to his early tutor, Buchanan. I don't remember his first
name.
Buchanan.
George.
Well, George was a common name back then, wasn't it? George, good old Georges. There's all these Georges running around. Yeah. George Buchanan, who apparently was sort of like a Thomas Smith sort of character as far as brilliant tutor, taking one student under his wing for a long period of time, very much like an Aristotle and Alexander the Great type of a story, except that there's a twist to it that Buchanan was a terrible abuser, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was, to the extent, I mean, I think I put in the book where the Countess of Mar, the husband of, or the wife of the regent at the time, got upset after he'd beaten him so badly, James, that, what do you say? Madam, I've whipped his arse, now you may kiss it. Apparently he would tremble at the name as an adult. It was so bad, but I mean, Buchanan had also been the tutor to Michel de Montaigne. Of course, somebody who we see in Shakespeare all over the place, Montaigne's ideas. I've kind of lost my train of thought there, but
I was just going
to say, obviously he knew his stuff. I mean, he was obviously could impart some knowledge. He was such an expert in Latin, which he wrote plays in Latin apparently. But he spoke Latin as if he was a native speaker. So he in himself was brilliant and, obviously passed on a lot to James. Yeah.
Well, it's got to be incredible. You're growing up, you're this child who doesn't get around very well. You have this extremely talented brain for learning and then also a thirst for knowledge. You have this tremendous tutor who himself is highly intelligent, skilled in languages, including a fluent speaker of Latin, but he whips you severely when you fail. at your lessons or at learning or displease him in some way or another. And in some sort of strange way, it almost drives James to achieve at even a higher level. And I wonder if that was maybe Buchanan's tactic as a tutor. I don't know, but maybe he wanted to strengthen the boy, or maybe it was about breaking his spirit because he was this young prince that everybody coddled after. I'm not sure. It's hard to know what his motivations were, but it obviously shaped and changed James in a variety of ways. As you mentioned, there were stories about him fearing even just the name of Buchanan at his mention. Because of the memories he had of having been beaten so badly as a young boy. And it makes for a very sympathetic character, doesn't it?
I think so. You know, he's when you read all sorts of people who've written on James, they all seem to at the start, in the preface or something, say how grateful they are to be able to study or be in the company, if you will, of such a brilliant, witty character. I think that's it's hard for me. I try to be objective, right? I mean, he certainly has some, how does it go? The evil men do lives on after the good is interred with their bones. I mean, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I mean, he's probably the single-handedly the most important, or you could trace every witch that ever got burned in England and New England. You can kind of trace to James and his demonology and his witch trials and all that kind of thing. So, but it's hard. It's hard, and I'm not a monarchist or anything. It's hard, but it's hard for me not to admire him and enjoy being in his company. Anyways.
Well, I think it's interesting when you look at his tenure as King of Scotland and then later as King of England. He does, ironically, reign over a fairly long period of peace. There are no major wars that occur. When he becomes King of England, he salves things over quite well with Spain for a great period of time. He has his alliances with Denmark through his wife, and that arranged marriage, which is very interesting in its own right, and how that plays out for him. He creates some animosity within court because of his favorites and his favoritism. And in some ways is very much like a Richard II to some degree with the way he handles that type of a thing, which makes that play very interesting when you look at it from a James perspective. But he was also, he wasn't above some nasty shit. I mean, he did some really nasty things, including the execution of rivals and making it play as though he was the victim. Like you say, the burning of witches. And I think there was in one case, didn't they just slaughter 100 or 200 women all from the same town in one instance, if I recall. He did some pretty horrible things, even though he never was a wager of war and was for the most part a pretty peaceful king.
He considered the Gaelic speaking peoples of Scotland as barbarians and almost not human. But so he took beatify. How's it go? Blessed are the peacemakers in Latin, Beati Pacificae, or however it goes, as his motto. He was in terms of external wars, he didn't. In his last year of his life, he ended up declaring war on Spain. That's kind of a long story, but Charles had gone there trying to marry the Infanta and bungled it, and James, probably very far advanced in his dementia in the last year of his life, did declare war on Spain, but otherwise he didn't declare war on any other countries. He took it as matter of pride that he'd never, that he had good relations with kings of, Catholic kings and all the monarchs. So he, when you compare him to, who do you compare him to? If you compare him to other early modern monarchs, he's great. He's, we put him up against virtually any of them. Most of them are vicious bastards, right? What he was is you just could not trust him. I wouldn't trust him. I think he'd be fun to be at the dinner table with him, but he was very well, you just couldn't trust him, I guess is the way to put it.
He definitely had a taste for all of the finer things too, and it got him into quite a bit of trouble throughout his lifetime. I think about when I was reading some of the passages that you included about him, I kept thinking, and because of the context of it all, and especially because of the play Macbeth and how it is commonly associated with him for a variety of reasons in a variety of different ways, I feel like I was listening to Malcolm speak to Macduff about all of the things that he would be if he were king in his speech to Macduff, where he's basically testing Macduff to make sure that Macduff hasn't been sent there by Macbeth to try to lure him into a trap. And Malcolm says, no, I would be all of these horrible, I'd be worse than Macbeth. I'd be all these horrible things. I would want all of your daughters, and I would want all of your lands, and I would spend all of the money, and I would eat all of the finest foods while others starved. And James kind of did that though, didn't he? Like, he loved his big banquets. He loved to spend money. He showered. One of the things though, it's interesting, he showered gifts upon people left and right throughout his life. He spent a ton of money on giving people presents. He was like, the Santa Claus of monarchs in this sort of weird way. But he also had an appetite for sex. I mean, any way he could get it, men, women, boys, couples together on their wedding night. There's several instances of that where he was like, I'm so glad that you two got married. I'm joining you on your wedding night. Whoo! And in fact, one of those was the Earl of Montgomery and his wife, Susan Vere. Which
That's
makes
right. Henry Risley,
interesting connection there, right? Like he wanted to be, I think it was the Earl of Montgomery, was the Earl of Montgomery, the Earl of Pembroke, but one of those two illustrious brothers, which we'll be talking about in just a minute, obviously, because that's a huge connection to the First Folio. But he spent a ton of money on their wedding festivities. And then, according to reports, spent the night with them in their wedding bed on their wedding night.
Well, on the next morning, apparently I think somebody wrote in or on, choose what you think is, more likely. But so the night after their wedding night, he joined them, probably in their bed, probably, supposedly just asking them prurient questions, but, how much, how far that got, I don't know.
Well, even just to be like, okay, so maybe he didn't participate. Maybe he was just a creepy voyeur type. He was like, I'm gonna show up and sit on the edge of your bed and say, well, how was it? Was he any good? Yeah. Was she any good? Did you enjoy yourselves? Tell me the details. I mean, that's kind of weird, right? Like the king shows up and he's like, hey, tell me about last night. How'd it go? But according to the reports, he was only in like his undershirt and underclothes, right? In his nightgown. He like shows up in his pajamas. He's like, here, I'm in my jammies. Gonna come hang out with you guys. It's kind of strange, isn't it?
Yeah, oh, totally. I mean, in effect, he was, he certainly, to the extent I don't know how much he enjoyed sex with women, he was definitely, what we'd call homosexual now. He was certainly more attracted to men. He had these male favorites, the pretty boys, which Henry Risley certainly was, but he seemed to get the most pleasure out of them, right? Like this wedding night. It wasn't just like, I want to have sex with you. I want to explore your sex with this woman. I don't think he was interested in Susan Vere sexually, but he I guess, got off on, like I say, them procreating his male favorites. And, I of course make the point that it's connected to the procreation sonnets. I think what better
Early in
candidate?
his marriage to his wife, Anna, I think she was like the Princess of Denmark, wasn't she?
Denmark.
Yeah. It seems like the early chronicles of that they had at least a communal friendship. They had a mutual respect for each other as members of royal blood. They seem to have enjoyed each other's time together quite well. She gets pregnant with their first son, Henry. That didn't come from chance. I mean, obviously, so he obviously at least engaged in sex with women because he did father 3 children by her.
Yes.
We don't know if he fathered any other children by any other women. He didn't seem to have mistresses at all, only boy toys.
It seemed to be that he was interested in men, I think.
Yeah.
It's quite.
But
it's funny because. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, they had this huge rift over their firstborn son, Henry, when he wanted to send Henry off to be raised by others and do the prince thing. And she was like, no, that's my baby boy, and I'm not leaving him. He's staying with me. And that ended it. That ended, like, they barely even spoke to each other after that, after he put his foot down and said, no, the boy is going to go live over here in northern Scotland, far away from us, to protect him and me from any plots or any conspiracies. And that's the end of it. And she apparently shut him down.
Yeah. I mean, she came from a quite a loving family, which is unusual for the early modern royal family. But apparently her father, Frederick, and his wife were close and loving. And she grew up in this loving environment, of a family environment. And James grew up, of course, being told his mom was a whore and with no family whatsoever, and dangerous monarchy, like a dangerous crown, and his head was very uneasy the whole time. And you needed to be in Scotland. It was a pack of wolves there, right? So for him, it was important that Henry be kept separate. It kind of kept nonsense from these nobles trying to kidnap people, to try and kidnap the king and then say, do this and do that. It was kind of a safety thing that they kept them separate. So they've just clashed on that. I mean, you can imagine Anna's, what do you mean I'm never going to see my son? That's, I'm not going to put up with that. And that was basically it for their, loving marriage. He was always very respectful to her, though.
It appears that there wasn't any animosity, and she always had the trappings of a queen, and especially when he moves to London, and now he's king of England as well, and that's when he did move Henry there as well. Like, they all move together.
It's a lot safer to be the royal family in London than in Edinburgh. Right?
Yeah, right. Well, that makes total sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was England was stable. Scotland at that time was. I mean, another child, a little girl, and then another son, Charles, who eventually, as we know, becomes Charles the First. Because Henry unfortunately didn't make it, as is common in the world of that time, obviously. But so they definitely were still seeing each other, and still, at the very minimum, at least twice, they went to bed together because they end up with 2 more kids. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we don't know for sure. I mean, right? Anna gave birth to 2 kids. I can't say for sure that they were James.
Well, I suppose,
right? I mean, seriously.
I suppose that. Well, especially because he was.
We assume. They said they were, and we assume so. But yeah,
he was spending a lot of time.
Otherwise, I'm not trying to say that
of his favorite boys, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Interesting thing that I wasn't aware of until reading your book was how young he was when he has his first, and I'll call it love affair with another man. He's somewhere around like 13 years old. He's very newly
the age of Juliet.
recognized as king. And this 37-year-old man, cousin of his, comes into his life. And from that point forward, the two of them are practically inseparable for quite a number of years. And I found that to be an interesting part of the story that I didn't know about. And I didn't know that he had this much older man sort of come, and I don't know if I'm going to use the word groom him, but definitely there was a lot of influence over him as this older, good-looking, dashing man who was also a relative, who takes James under his wing, provides him this love and affection that he's never had throughout his life, provides him the type of validation and approval that he never seemed to get from George Buchanan during his life. Instead of beating him, he's caressing him and loving him, and they're going to bed together. And his whole world changes. And I think the whole world changes. You know what I'm saying? Because I think that helped shape who James then later becomes long before he actually accepts the crown of England.
Yeah, agreed. Catholic. He converted. So Esme Stewart, his cousin, was a French Catholic, and he'd come and he converted to Protestantism. You know what I'm trying to say.
That's easy for you to say.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't know. I've never had
Protestantism.
Protestantism.
He became a Protestant.
There we go. Thank you. And he converted, and he even so the Protestants lords basically fixed him up, and they were able to at one point, I guess, separate when James was separate from Esme, and then kind of kidnap James and kick Esme Stewart back to France. And Esme Stewart went back to France, and even though he was under a lot of pressure once he returned to convert back to Catholicism, he didn't. He remained a Protestant for the rest of his short life after that. Some people, they kind of say he died of a broken heart. He was he came back after being exiled from his beloved James, and was depressed and then died shortly thereafter.
And in a really interesting, this would make such a, I don't know. And again, when you learn about James, you go, wow, what an incredible life, and how it's been so overshadowed. But standalone, it really is like a movie waiting to happen, because then this older man who, has been separated from him, exiled to France. They've got James basically a king in captivity again, like he's an infant again. And these lords are trying to lord over the country. And Esme Stewart, the older man, the older cousin, by all accounts, dies of a broken heart, separated from the love of his life, and then has his heart removed and sent back to James in this final act of devoted, passionate love. I mean, you can't write this stuff, right? Wow, what a Valentine. Okay, here's my heart. It's always belonged to you, kind of thing. It's kind of crazy story.
It is. It's hard to wrap. That's one of those, when we try and get our modern minds into the Renaissance or early modern kind of way of thinking. So romantic to pack your heart off, and that's just so gross to think of, but it was meant as a profoundly love, this, my heart belongs to you, not my wife. Yeah.
And he was, of course, married, because, as many of these gay men of that time were definitely married. Sure. But again, as you point out in your book, and has been pointed out on this program before, that the term homosexuality didn't really exist at that time. Nobody was called gay or identified as, I'm homosexual. I mean, you either wanted to have a lot of sex, or you wanted to have no sex. You either wanted to have sex with everyone, or you only wanted to have sex with women, or you only wanted to have sex with men. It was just kind of like they were so fluid, I suppose, in a lot of ways. And as the
Yeah.
is the old antique Romans, so to speak, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Well, he's got an incredible life, and definitely because of some of the incredible aspects of his life, he definitely, as you point out in your book, and now we'll shift gears a little bit here, fits a lot of the profile of what those of us who have examined the Shakespeare authorship mystery would seek in a candidate for authorship. And you spell that out a lot in your book. And I'd like you to sort of explain to listeners what you think are some of those key reasons that led you to believe that James may be the author known as William Shakespeare.
Okay, well, I mean, from the start, Shakespeare authorship was thrust upon me, as I explained in the preface, when I was watching this BBC show, Hollow Crowns, I think it was called, try to explain how he didn't get arrested and there was no consequences to him when Richard III is put on by
Richard II.
Sorry, yeah, you're right. Richard II, sorry, was put on the night before the Essex Rebellion for the conspirators. They paid supposedly extra, right, to put this performance on, and there's no consequences to him. I mean, the presenter said something like, it was a dangerous time. Christopher Marlowe was murdered. Thomas Kidd was tortured. Ben Jonson was thrown into jail. What would happen? Could Shakespeare get in trouble for this? And the guest on there was, I think, from the Royal Shakespeare Company, explained it that, well, he was able to, he was so good at metaphor, and he played, which is true, Shakespeare, the author, how you can't really nail him down. What's his belief or whatever? He's able to show all the sides. But they explained that's how he got away from getting into any trouble. I mean, it took far less than a attempted rebellion for the Tudor state to do all sorts of horrendous things to people. They're not going to stop at, we'll arrest Shakespeare. Oh no, he's too good at literary antithesis or something. And so that was kind of what was like, what?
Francis Walsingham and his spy network. Well, no, I guess we'll let that one slide because he's so good at literary antithesis.
Yeah, exactly. It makes you try and picture that going, it doesn't make any sense. That didn't make sense. And then the program late, again, while I've got this in my head, I mean, I'd sat down, I'd heard of the Shakespeare authorship question. I'd watched a Frontline documentary about it, Much Ado About Something. I'd done a shallow dive of reading it, before. But when I sat down and was watching this BBC show, I was assuming I was watching a show about William Shakespeare from Stratford and how, all this kind of stuff. So anyway, they explain about how he gets away scot-free from the Essex Rebellion and its connection with Richard II. And then they say, okay, so then James comes to the throne, and we don't know what play they had on that Christmas, but it probably was the Danish play. After all, his wife was Danish. He'd gone to and actually first met her when he went over to Denmark. He'd stayed at Elsinore Castle. So anyway, so the BBC guy saying, well, he would have put on, it was probably Hamlet. Why not? Okay. And then it kind of explaining how Hamlet shows has these things about his life, about how his, how his mother had married what looks like, the alleged murderer of her other husband. I think it was described as King James must have felt ill at ease as he's watching this story unfold. And I was, and that just made me think, what kind of crazy person is going to put on as their first play something, that's going to make the monarch ill at ease when he can be thrown in jail, tortured, murdered, whatever. They kind of make it out as if Shakespeare, would have thrilled to it. Who I'm putting on, I'm showing James's life and, the embarrassing personal things to do with it, and sitting there thrilling over it. And that was it. I was just like, maybe it was James. Like that explained how this could have happened, right? How you'd have Hamlet, which was registered before James took the throne. I should say, I'm sorry that I'm kind of getting all over the place here, but Hamlet was registered with the Stationer's Register in 1600, right? I think it's 1600. It was before James took the throne.
It is. You're right. It's before he took the throne. He takes the throne. Elizabeth died, I believe, in March of 1603. And he takes the throne. I think his coronation doesn't happen right away, but basically he's there by July. And so the first Christmas, if you're talking about like the Christmas revels, would be December 1603 into January, even into February 1604. Because, when it was winter, they partied from basically what was, Christmas Eve until I believe it's Michaelmas, which is February 2nd or February 1st, I believe, somewhere around there, I think.
Okay, I think Michaelmas, I thought it was in September, but
I could have that. But there's a feast day that's like February. That's sort of like the end of winter, which is now why we have like Groundhog's Day on that day.
Yeah. Okay, but my point is that Shakespeare, whoever he was, or he or she was, registered Hamlet a few years before James took the throne. And in fact, if it was, say, 1600, 1601, it was after the Essex Rebellion, James was going to be king. There had been a secret arrangement with Robert Cecil that James would be the king. Robert Cecil, after the Essex Rebellion, was like, okay, this succession uncertainty has to stop. We're going to make an agreement that James is going to be the king. But that was kept secret from everyone, including Elizabeth I herself. So Shakespeare registers Hamlet that has these details that conform to James's life, not even knowing that he's going to become the king, supposedly. Right? So that all of this is to say that it makes sense if it was James that was the author, or somebody authorized by him, someone up in Scotland or something, that he was, okay, you can put these, create this play Hamlet and put these details.
Well, you're definitely not the first person to paint Hamlet as a succession play.
Oh no, of course.
I think that there is some real strong argument there, and I agree with you that there are plenty of parallels in Hamlet to James's life and what occurred there with his mother. Most likely, for all intents and purposes, she was conspiring with her lover to murder her husband. Marries him, I think, 3 months later.
Yeah.
Her husband always doubted whether or not he was the father of the baby that was to be born. I think he was murdered while she still carried the baby in the womb. Wait, I got that mixed up. So she murdered her first husband. Marries the second husband, gets pregnant. They come in, the lords of Scotland come in and murder her servant in front of her to try to cause her to have a miscarriage, but she doesn't, and she gives birth to the baby. Right? Is that how it goes?
Yeah, I mean that's almost it. So she's 5 months pregnant when these men burst into the room and stab her servant David Rizzio 50 times right in front of her, right, as if to cause a miscarriage, but doesn't. But that was Darnley, or at least his father. That was her first
they
husband.
They slaughter her Italian lover, basically, right?
Yes. So that fails. She gives birth later, and then so she gives birth to James in July of 65, and then in February of 66, Darnley is found after a huge explosion, destroys his lodgings, and he's found with he and his servant are found in an orchard. At first, they were trying to say that it was, meant for the Queen as well, meant for Mary. That's what she was saying at the very start. But then it was found that no, he'd been strangled. There was a napkin in his mouth. Right, he couldn't have just been killed in an explosion. And
so maybe they blew up the lodge to try to cover up the murder. Right, they tried to.
What I think was that.
But the Hamlet similarity is with the first husband who dies of an ear infection. So the author of the play combines those together. He has the culprit pour poison into the ear of the king while he is sleeping in an orchard. And here the two husbands of Mary are murdered all at once in one fell swoop in the play by combining both murders into one, basically, is what Hamlet does.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically is it a coincidence? If it was, say it wasn't James who wrote them, say it was either the Earl of Oxford. I mean, how is it a coincidence that that's in Hamlet? If so, why? If not, why is anyone else putting the details of King James's life into Hamlet and then registering them before he's even King of England? Right.
Well, it could be that he's either trying to support James as a successor, or trying to thwart James as a successor.
Which I guess would be the Earl of Oxford's motivation would be
Elizabeth was definitely considering it. You're right. It's not that they were keeping it a secret that James was a potential successor. They were keeping a secret that they were secretly conspiring with him behind her back for him to become king, right? That's the part. There's the treason part, is that Robert Cecil and James had this secret correspondence going on where they were plotting together. And you have to wonder now, when you really examine James and you look at the fact that he did have this physical deformity throughout his life, if that wasn't something that sort of bonded those two men together, Robert Cecil, of course, being the famous hunchback and having his own deformity. And here were these two men of power who become very strange bedfellows, pardon the pun, even though I doubt that they actually ever went to bed together. Robert Cecil being a severe Puritan.
Robert Cecil wasn't James's type.
No, definitely not his type. But interesting how, they sort of had that thing in common to cleave to. And James took up the same habit that Elizabeth had of sort of nicknaming those around him, and I'm going to be doing a future episode about the importance of code names, not only in Elizabethan times, but even now in modern times. The United States government has code names for all of the major players in government. And so that's not a new thing. Code names have been around and still exist today in the highest levels of government in the world. But he had this sort of, it wasn't necessarily a code name, it was a nickname, everybody knew it, but I think he called him she called him her little imp, and James changed it and called him his little beagle, I think.
Okay. I actually had never heard that about little imp.
Yeah.
Because she only had Robert Cecil a few years at the end of her life, I guess. It was William Cecil mostly.
Right.
When did he die?
But the little imp was around, right? Like, William Cecil was grooming his son for quite some time to be his successor. So Elizabeth and Robert had a lot of years in each other's presence while William was sort of, mentoring his son to take his place someday.
Yeah. So anyways, I guess I should get back to, from that, after this, watching the show, which did all this kind of stuff didn't make sense to me. I just started researching it, and I was always trying to, at the start, assuming that it would be just there'd be something that would disprove that he was the, I didn't really know much about him. I thought, okay, find out some reason why he wouldn't be the case. And it just seems like the more that I looked into it, the more it looked like that James was Shakespeare, that he had a motivation to keep his identity secret. It's obviously, whenever he would write something as a king, he couldn't get away from the fact that he was the king, and there would be, people get their nose out of joint, or there would be implications for his political implications for his poetry. So I think what he did was he was a poet king. He thought of himself as a poet king. He surrounded himself with courtiers and brought in courtiers from all over the place for their literary talent. He had there's a Castilian band, as maybe what they were called, these guys. And I think that he saw the advantage of writing from the persona of a commoner, but also an Englishman. And then he used his plays, many of them, most of course the history plays, but other ones, like we're talking Hamlet, to further his agenda, because he wanted to claim the throne of England as a way, kind of soft power, they would say these days, right? Propaganda, value of writing from the point of view of a commoner Englishman, but putting subtly and in the background, if you want to kind of put it that way, the ideas that he wanted to put forth, that he was, that his claim to the throne was based around primogeniture. If anyone else was going to take the throne other than James, he had the best claim to it through succession, through primogeniture. But other candidates to succeed Elizabeth, might have succeeded because of the impediments that were put on it. There was, I don't know how much detail you want to get into this, but impediments put on a claim to the throne. Henry VIII had written the whole side of the family from Scotland out of his will, that they couldn't inherit the throne. There was a statute that said no one with foreign birth could inherit the throne. Of course, he was born in Scotland. Elizabeth and Parliament had enacted in the 1580s the Act of Association, saying that the heir of anyone who had attempted to overthrow Queen Elizabeth would be disqualified from taking the throne. And of course, that's exactly what James was. He was the heir of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was executed in 87 for that very thing. He explicitly and with his name would write in support of him succeeding the throne. So what I think he was doing, if he was Shakespeare, or he had the motivation to be able to put, he could write the true law of monarchies and say, this is why the king primogeniture is best, and you should have. We don't want elective monarchy, for example. We want it to be through primogeniture. Through the Shakespeare plays, those can be put into the kind of into the ether or into the conversation without it being King James saying it with his name on it. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Well, you mentioned, obviously, you mentioned that he's the poet king, and I don't know that a lot of people know, and this is sort of a question I have for you, because he did publish works. He did publish poetry.
Yes.
He did publish treatises. He loved the sonnet, and he is a sonneteer, and we have sonnets of his. I don't think they'd come anywhere close to being as good as the Shakespeare sonnets in any way. I think his writing isn't as creative. It isn't as flowing. It's forced rhyme in many cases. The meter is chunky. So certainly, and people say that about other potential authorial candidates about their juvenilia. So I could see where, 6 of one, half a dozen of another. He did use.
But you also got to remember that he didn't publish. He published his poetry outside of the years of the active Shakespeare. The career of William Shakespeare is, whatever he wrote up until 93, the publishing of Venus and Adonis, and then it's over, I guess, whenever 1613, or is that when Shakespeare is supposed to have died? 1613, I can't remember. Shakespeare, and he only published poetry before 1593 and after 1613. But then also, if he were the author, of course, the theory would be that he's selecting poetry to attach the name William Shakespeare to, which is different from the poetry that he would be publishing attached to the name of James.
Well, you got somebody in the background there who wants to join in the conversation.
Yeah, it's my wife's. Can you hold on one second?
That's okay. Bring her along. Let's see what she has to say about Anna, Queen of Scotland, and later Queen of England.
Okay, sorry about that.
So the thing I want to point out to the people listening is that they should be aware of too, and they should look this up, is find out some of James's writings, do some comparative samples, because I think it's worthy of doing. Also know that James did use a pseudonym occasionally as well. Now, they weren't as clever as William Shakespeare. If William Shakespeare is a pseudonym, as I believe it is, it's not as clever. It's not as clever as Mark Twain or George Orwell. But it's certainly, he wasn't truly trying to conceal his identity that much. He was kind of like, haha, it's me, but it's not me. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But it is really important to note that I believe he's the first monarch in European history to publish poetry under his own name.
Yes.
And that's an incredible thing to make note of in any of this study and in any of the, discovery into this mystery. Is that something that's definitely worth noting. And you point out in your book quite well. I mean, I think it's very interesting, and those who are listening who are staunch Oxfordians, I think they'll find the book interesting for this point too, is you dive into J. Thomas Loney and you dive into the criteria that he established for searching for a candidate. And then you sort of do a like Diana Price version of, here are all the places where King James checks the box as a literary person, as a person who fits Loney's sort of schematic of what Shakespeare must be. And you do check off quite a few. I mean, you really get to the point of, okay, he definitely fits this. He definitely fits this. If we're putting a puzzle together, this piece exists, this piece exists, this piece exists. Yeah. I think with any candidate, one of the big problems that we all have is we're looking for that final piece to fill in and complete the puzzle. And unfortunately, to date, We don't have those pieces yet for anyone. But one of the reasons why I really like your book and I really like your exploration into this is it definitely establishes that the Stratford man is not it. If you can look at James and look at how many ways that he could be it, each of the ways James could be it is a reason why Shakespeare of Stratford is definitely not it. And yes, James and Oxford and others like Stanley, for instance, I think, and maybe even those who say, Nash, Rutledge, North. I think one of the things that you find is all of those candidates all fit similar molds and have a lot in common and all check a lot of J. Thomas Sloaney's boxes. And I think that's an important thing to note. I think it's an important area of research and mystery discovery going on there.
Yeah. What do you think of, I make the point with Loney's criterion with respect to an Englishman with literary tastes, and that he confined his search to only English native-born speakers. And I just don't, there's no question James was absolutely fluent in English. He was writing he wrote back and forth in English. He was connected to the literary scene in England. He was admired Philip Sidney. Supposedly, according to him, he was taught to speak Latin ere I speak Scots, so his first language, according to James, was Latin, and then Scots, and then it would be English, right?
Well, and he has that famous moment where he debates the pronunciation.
Do you think that that's an error on the part of, is that reasonable? The way that I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
I think I always say, Ian, and regular listeners of the program know that I say this. And in fact, whenever I say this, I know it bristles some of those who fashion themselves as being the top Shakespeare mystery super sleuths out there. But I truly believe in my mind of mind and in my heart of hearts, you cannot understand this author. You can't come close to fully understanding this author if you only speak one language.
Yeah.
Because it's obvious to me that this author was fluent in multiple languages to the point that he thought in multiple languages. He could think in Italian. He could think in French. He could think in Latin. He could think in Greek. He could think in Spanish. And I believe he most likely also could think in Hebrew. This brilliant mind surpasses any of ours, and it's impossible for us to truly grasp the works without being able to think in those multiple languages. It's why he created so many new words and had the capacity to do so, because he combined languages together to create words that meant new things and painted new pictures for us, the reader, and for the listener, the audience, to the plays being presented. So I agree that, sticking to, it had to be a native English speaker might not be the accurate way to approach it. And there are those, or many of those, who claim and would stand behind an Italian candidate, that Shakespeare's Italian. I have an upcoming guest in a future episode who translates the original novellas from Italian as the source works of Shakespeare's works. And ironically, one of the next ones coming up is about Othello. And I mention that because I know that's one of the areas that you feel James is really connected to, and whether he wrote Othello or the Othello has aspects about it that were aimed to him or for him, or even text maybe was added later because the folio doesn't come about till near the end of his reign. And these plays, I believe, when they're being put into folio form, are being perfected over those years, even though it says these are the true and complete original manuscripts. I don't believe that. I believe that the folio is a for posterity version. I think that if you look at some of that source material, you obviously was somebody who spoke Italian. And then, when you tie back to James, he hired an Italian tutor to come in and teach he and his wife both Italian.
Yes.
And he spent a lot of time together. I mean, who knows? Maybe he had a flavor for an Italian lover just like his mama.
Maybe. I mean, certainly if he were the author, I mean, you can see how, the tutelage of Castelvetro was the name of the fellow he got to teach him. That, he'd be bringing in Italian works to read, to learn, because that's how he's learning a language, all of the sources. But then, of course, you'd be able to talk to Castelvetro about Italy, right? About, things, all the little things that seem to Oxfordians have been really good at pointing out all the connections to. Look at, this is somebody who seems to maybe have walked the streets in Venice or that kind of thing. So first of all, it'd be natural for all of the source material they'd be looking at it. It would be Italian. The other thing, though, is he also, of course, had spies all over the place, and he had spies all over in Italy. He was trying. He was a Protestant. He maintained the Protestantism. He came to, there's again that word, came to England maintaining that, but he kept the diplomatic options open with the Catholic powers. And so and he would have, spies in Italy that were reporting back to him all this diplomatic stuff, but he's also literary and they were literary. So he, it'd be easy for him to get all sorts of information about it. Both, not just the sources of Italian. There's no question, whoever the author was, they read Italian, right? Because the sources, there's no English sources available. The way that, I don't have to, I'm preaching to the choir here, aren't I, about that he read Italian. I just think that it'd be also for James a lot of opportunity to discuss Italy with people who had been there.
Sure, and if I believe correctly, one of his tutors or one of the people in his employ was the first translator of Machiavelli's The Prince?
Machiavelli's The Prince.
Yeah. So
William Fowler.
So Fowler translates Machiavelli for James at James' request, I believe. And then it's ironic because there's that moment where James basically goes in and murders the 5th Earl of Bothwell. I think it's the son of his earlier rival, right? The man who killed his father, kind of a thing, right? He had to. His revenge,
Bothwell was going to get the devil to kill him, right?
Right. Well, that's James's version, right? But he totally pulls a Machiavelli on those guys, right? That's a total move right out of The Prince. And I say this all the time. Is if you want to understand world leaders, you've got to read The Prince, including today's world leaders. From the moment The Prince was written and any world leader got their hands on it to this day in history, right now, as you're listening to this program, leaders of the world continue to follow Machiavelli's advice. And if you haven't read it, you're going to have a real hard time understanding the geopolitical scene. Because I guarantee you, all of the major leaders of the world have a classical education, and they've all read it. They've also read The Art of War. If you haven't read those books, don't wonder why you might be confused about the relationships between world leaders going on in the world right now.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear that that's what James was doing, and he was pretty good at it. And of course, Robert Cecil. Talk about it. That's such a wicked pairing. Those two brains together. No wonder why they came to power the way they did. But I do think it's interesting. Ironically, Cecil dies at the very young age of like 49 years old. He doesn't actually get to enjoy the life that he has built for himself, that he usurped for himself in a lot of ways, the way his father did, who lived into his late 70s, at least early 70s. I can't remember exactly how old William Cecil was when he died, but and then James doesn't live much longer, and basically, by all accounts, loses his whole damn mind before he dies. Like, I don't know if we call him an Alzheimer's victim. It's dementia. It's syphilitic brain, probably more likely, is my guess, that it's related to some sort of a venereal thing that was common among the men of his family.
I think syphilis is one of those things that was it's kind of all over the place, but hidden or not spoken about openly, kind of thing.
I want to talk about.
I've wondered whether Tycho Brahe, who supposedly lost his nose in a duel, I've wondered, maybe he lost it to syphilis, right?
Yes,
because that was one of the things apparently that could happen with syphilis.
People don't know that Tycho Brahe entertained the king and queen on his island for a time. That's another great piece of history that you find in your book that's really worth noting. And James obviously is enamored with him because he writes poetry to him. Right, is another thing I bet most people don't know. There's a lot of fascinating details about him that certainly would put him in the realm of being of that type of genius to have created the works of Shakespeare. I don't know where he finds the time to do it, and I don't know where he has the motivation to write the plays that aren't succession related or don't advance his cause to be and maintain his position as king. But certainly, as you say, the history plays are good for him. He's of Lancastrian descent. He's technically a cousin to Elizabeth through her father's side, through Henry VII, whose sister is his, I believe, great-grandmother, Margaret Tudor. So there's certainly strength in that argument that, all those history plays that are strengthening the Tudor claim are all technically connected to the Lancastrian claim, which is, how they all come to power to begin with. So I definitely agree with so much of what you have. I do have, obviously questions about, what about the early court performances of plays that we're pretty sure were early versions of Shakespeare plays, and how could he and why would he have been sending those over to England during his, younger years in his, 20s?
So what do you mean? Okay, so what do you mean by that? Like,
well, we have all of these documentations of court performances that went on that were plays that most likely that either had very similar titles or similar storylines based on reports of performances, whether those performances were at the Inns of Court or at Whitehall, long before the name William Shakespeare appears. There's some playwright who is putting out these plays and stories that later become a lot of the Shakespeare canon. And so my belief is whoever the author is had to have been producing those before inventing the name William Shakespeare, or before using the actor from Stratford, if he even was an actor, as their front man.
Well, sure. I mean, anything written before Venus and Adonis, right?
Yeah.
It seems like so. But they don't. It's not attached to William Shakespeare. You're saying these plays. That's a problem. It's kind of speculative, but these plays did not have the name William Shakespeare attached to them.
No, they don't have anyone's name attached. William Shakespeare.
Oh, they're anonymous. I see.
When you look at the history of plays and playwriting and the publication of plays, the name William Shakespeare changes the landscape forever. Nobody really cared about putting the author's name on plays until William Shakespeare, for that matter.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. who is, of course, Richard. He's just a neighbor of Richard Field, who was the apprentice to James's printer up in Scotland, Thomas Rotrolier. That's who James used to print his things that he put out in his own name. Richard Field was his apprentice, Thomas Rotrolier's apprentice. So, I mean, what I think kind of happened is if we were the case that James was the author, was that they said, okay, we need to attach a name to this. We need a commoner. Oh, okay. And then Richard Field, who's in England, because it was going to be published William Shakespeare was an English phenomenon, right? Obviously. And was going to be published in England, in London and whatnot. They took Richard Field's neighbor was William Shakespeare, and then they created the name William Shakespeare, just because, it's the proximity of Richard Field. I think that's, is there an explanation for the connection with Richard Field and Stratford?
I don't know. I doubt that there's anything there with regards to Shakespeare of Stratford. I mean, the thing about Shakespeare of Stratford is there's no literary connection to him at all, really, not until long after his death, and not until it becomes advantageous to do so, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah. I say William Shakespeare happened to be the neighbor of James VI printer's apprentice, right? And so there's the continuity there. They took the apprentice of Rotrolier, and it just happened. He happened to be...
And he said, and I'm going to use your neighbor as my pseudonym.
Yeah, this will be the guy, and we'll give him money and he'll be William Shakespeare. I don't know. For me, I don't try to too much worry about the details of the mechanics of how this would have happened. I try and see, okay, what can I find that connects, James and the works and that kind of thing at this point.
Well, Ian, what I always like to say about this mystery and to all of those in the Quiller Nation is there are no roads to avoid traveling. I think that every area,
I bet you get a lot of pushback from that.
I do, but I believe that every pathway is worth examining and every lens is worth looking through. And I believe just for myself, regardless of whether it changed my ultimate viewpoint on where the solution to this mystery exists, reading your book and your subsequent writings, and I'm going to talk about your Substack in just a second, reading your research, your works, and looking at this through a King James lens, I have already learned more than I knew. I have already considered more than I was willing to consider. And it has already opened doors in my mind of areas I want to now go back and look at and try to figure out what is the connection then between who I think the author is and James? Because I think what you have definitely proven to me is that James is a bigger factor than I immediately assumed. And now I have to re-examine some things and see how much of a factor did James become near the end, because it is near the end of what I believe is the career of whoever Shakespeare is when James becomes king. But that transition is more important than I think I've realized. And so I want to look at that more and look at that further. The transition from Elizabeth to James is plays a far greater role, if I may use that term, in this mystery than I first realized. And you've brought that to my attention, and I thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. One of the questions I would have if were I doing this examination is, why was Shakespeare, the author, whoever he was, so interested in Britain, right? Not England, not, but the idea of Britain, right, that you see in King Lear. Because I don't know, it seems clear to me that that's something, right? I mean, it's kind of appears in Henry V, and it's, of course, in Cymbeline and King Lear explored. That was certainly one of James's, priorities, was that he, not only priority, but priority that he fought against unsuccessfully, for Englishmen to start thinking of themselves as Britons rather than Englishmen, for example.
There's sort of a unification aspect to it, right? Like trying to unify them all together. Well, that would have made, obviously, a very strong Central European nation more powerful than any other. And I think, when you look at how the city-states of Italy, if they had been able to unite, the many times they tried to, obviously, and failed, but imagine the many times that if they had tried to and succeeded, how that would have changed the history of the world, especially through the 15th century, particularly, right? And look how many other countries in Europe fight wars with each other in Italy over Italian city-states instead of in their own countries or at their own borders too, right? There's sort of proxy wars that were going on all over Italy at that time. Not unlike the world we see today, where you have proxy wars that still go on, right? Oh, we're not going to fight you on your shore. We're not going to fight you on our shore, but we'll let these other countries battle it out and we'll fight you on their shores and let them suffer all of the damage, right?
Yeah.
No, I don't want my country to be war-torn, but I'll send you money so that your country can be war-torn while you fight my enemy. That'll work for me. That's good. Yeah. Very Machiavellian, by the way. So I want to remind everybody listening, his name is Ian Stockdale. He is the author of Shakespeare, the King James Version. It's approximately around 200 pages or so. The first 100 pages is great, enthralling history of James and the rise of the Stuarts. And then the second half of it is, of course, Ian's connections of James to the Shakespearean canon, and then his theories about why James fits as a potential authorship candidate. And then he does break down many of the plays and look at them through a King James lens, which I believe, again, as I said, is definitely worth looking at and finding what connections that you can find between your favorite candidate and James, or maybe you get convinced that James may be the guy. And if you want to learn more, you can go to Ian's Substack. It's ianstockdale.substack.com. That's Ian Stockdale, spelled IANSTOCKDALE.substack.com. He's got a couple of new pieces up there that were also very interesting that I just popped on. Well, one of them, we don't have time to get into it right now. We'll have to have you back again, Ian, but I love the bit that you include about the clowns, the clown in Othello and the bagpipes that show up in Othello, which is very interesting read, ladies and gentlemen. You definitely want to pop into that. You can ask yourself, how come the clown is always cut from the play? And did you realize that Othello kept in his employment a court jester, for lack of a better term, in this clown who is telling these musicians they can go away because the general doesn't want to hear them anymore? And then there's also a wonderful piece about the Veronese painting, the painting by Veronese that is in the Ducal Palace, the Doge's Palace in Venice. To this day, it still hangs there, I believe. And it would have hung there at the time of the writing of Othello, definitely prior to the time of the writing of Othello, because it memorializes the Catholic fleet's victory over the Turkish Ottomans at sea, which was basically sort of the liberation of the Mediterranean at that time from the Ottoman Turks. And it is also mentioned, one of the many, many references to a beautiful work of art that you find in the Shakespearean canon. And so that's definitely worth looking at as well.
Well, the Veronese, they, as far as I could tell, nobody's ever pointed this out, but it just seems quite clear when he's, it's all in just the three lines there, right? News, lads, our war is done, and the Turks have been banged up by this tempest, whatever the exact wording is, and then the other guy says the ship's put in a Veronese.
So Vanessa, right?
Vanessa.
Vanessa is the name of the ship, and it's definitely homage to the painter Veronese, who painted this magnificent painting of the victory of the Catholic fleet over the Turks. It's a wonderful reference. I don't know that I've ever seen anyone point it out before. For those who are of the Oxfordian leaning, it would be more evidence that Oxford stood there in the Doge's palace and looked at that painting, which would have also been hanging there during the moment that Othello is called before the Venetian council to answer for having secretly married Brabantio's daughter, but we have better things to worry about. We need you, general, to go to war. And then that, there's also the connection of that to
which is probably also cut out a lot in productions as well, right?
Yeah, and then there's also the connection of that to John of Messina, which then connects to Much Ado About Nothing. So there's a wonderful little triangle there that you can find, and you can read more about it at Ian's Substack, and you can subscribe to it too. There's a little button there once you get on there where you can click and be a part of his newsletter and find out more as he continues to delve into this realm of research. Ian, thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's been very intriguing. And as I said, I really enjoyed your book. It really taught me so much about James beyond anything, regardless of whether we agree or disagree on the theories. I learned so much. You've definitely done your research, and it's well written. It's an easy read. I found myself, as I read it, hearing myself as like a narrator. It was almost as if it was something that I would produce, and I want to be like, I could do an audio recording of this book. It'd be awesome.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your kind words, and I appreciate you having me on. This has been a fascinating discussion.
Very good. Well, keep up the good work, and as we always like to say to our friends out there, keep asking questions.
Keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.